Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was a bitter March evening when the strange tale first reached us, an evening where the fog hung low over Baker Street like a dirty handkerchief, and the gas lamps threw halos into the gloom rather than any meaningful light. I had just returned from a tiresome consultation with a patient in Haverstock Hill, and was unbuttoning my overcoat when Holmes, who had been lounging on the settee with the attitude of one who is half asleep and half contemptuous of the world, suddenly sat bolt upright. "Listen, Watson," he said, tapping the newspaper beside him. "This, I think, is no ordinary disappearance." I approached and took the paper from his hand. The article was short, pushed to the bottom of the third page. Noted linguist and Oxford lecturer, Mr. Felix Holloway, vanished from a private dinner party last evening, mid-conversation. Holloway, 49, had been addressing a small circle of guests at the home of Lord Tavisham, when he reportedly paused in the middle of a sentence and never resumed it. Witnesses described the disappearance as instantaneous and utterly inexplicable. Scotland Yard is investigating the matter. I raised an eyebrow. Vanished mid-sentence. Surely someone followed him out, Holmes. He must have left the room and wasn't noticed. That is the point of contention, Holmes replied, rising and pacing toward the fire. According to multiple guests, Holloway was in the process of quoting a line from Horace when he faltered, blinked, and ceased to be present. "Some form of stroke," I suggested. "A collapse behind furniture, perhaps." "A natural hypothesis, Doctor," Holmes said approvingly. But he did not collapse. He did not fall. He did not even reach for a chair or door. One moment he was speaking. The next, there was only silence and an empty space. I furrowed my brow. The room was locked. No, quite the opposite. The room was open to a hallway, with 2 footmen nearby, and all other guests present and seated. No one saw him walk out. No one heard a door. There was no delay. No one even had time to blink. Holmes turned and examined me with that keenness I had come to both respect and dread. "Watson, you have seen many unusual cases. Would you not agree? This qualifies as impossible." "I do," I admitted reluctantly, "at least from what little we know." Holmes smiled as if I had passed a test. "Good. Then pack a bag, my dear fellow. Lord Tavisham has requested my assistance through private courier. We are expected in Oxfordshire by noon tomorrow." "Courier?" I asked. "When did it arrive?" "An hour ago. I found the letter more persuasive than the news article." He handed it to me. The envelope bore the sigil of the Tavisham estate. The handwriting inside was smooth, anxious, and unmistakably noble. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you in utmost haste and confidentiality. What has occurred at my table tonight defies all reason, and will surely invite the most vulgar speculation. Mr. Felix Holloway, esteemed guest and friend, has disappeared in a manner I can only describe as vanishing. There was no noise, no movement, no magic trick, only his words, then his absence. I implore your aid. Scotland Yard has sent a man, but I am not optimistic. Please come at once. Yours, Lord Percival Tavisham." "What do you make of it?" I asked, folding the letter carefully. Holmes was already at the sideboard, preparing a small travel case. "I make of it a locked-room mystery in spirit, if not in architecture. Disappearing mid-sentence. That is a phrase meant to arrest attention, and it has succeeded. Now we must determine if the disappearance was truly physical or something more elaborate." As we prepared for the journey, Holmes grew unusually pensive. He spoke little, though I knew better than to mistake that for inaction. He smoked 2 full pipes in silence, staring at the framed map of Oxford that he had unrolled upon our dining table. "I once read a monograph by Mr. Holloway," Holmes said absently, tapping the map. His work on ancient runes and linguistic ciphers was quite clever, not always rigorous, but clever. "Do you think this is connected to his academic work?" "Tibly. Or it could be something as pedestrian as a financial scandal or domestic entanglement. But the manner of the disappearance he trailed off. We departed early the next morning on the 7:15 express to Oxford. Arriving by mid-morning, Lord Tavisham's man awaited us at the station. A grim-faced valet named Harbury, who whisked us into a polished brougham without delay. The countryside outside the window passed in fog-choked hedgerows and low stone fences. It was a melancholy setting for so peculiar a mystery. We reached Tavisham Hall just before noon, a stately Georgian manor, nestled among bare-limbed oaks. A chill hung in the air that seemed to seep into the bones of the house itself. Lord Tavisham greeted us in the drawing-room, his manner stiff and severe. "I thank you both for coming," he said, offering Holmes a firm hand, and nodding curtly at me. "The Yard has sent Inspector Thackeray, but he is uncreative." Holmes smiled faintly. "Creativity is not always welcomed in police work, my lord. Perhaps you might walk us through the events as you experience them." Tavisham's face tensed. "Certainly." It was a private dinner, 8 in total. Mr. Holloway was seated near the fireplace, speaking of Roman aphorisms. He quoted Horace, "Pulvis et umbra sumus," and then he began another sentence, something like, "But consider what he does not say." And then, nothing. He was gone. "You mean he stopped speaking?" I asked. "No, Doctor," Tavisham said, looking directly at me. "I mean, he was no longer there. We looked to where he had been, and the chair was empty, as if he had blinked out of existence." Holmes folded his hands. "May we examine the room?" "Of course. We have left everything untouched." Holmes' eyes lit with a familiar glint, the fire of challenge of the game afoot. He turned to me and said, "Come, Watson, let us examine the scene where a man vanished." Mid-sentence, Chapter 2, Holmes and the Vanishing Sentence. The drawing-room of Tavisham Hall, into which Holmes and I were led, was a handsome and scholarly affair. High ceilings with exposed beams, walls lined with dusty volumes and gilt-framed portraits, and a hearth that still smoldered faintly from the previous evening's gathering. A long mahogany table was set near the center, flanked by upholstered chairs, and illuminated by a glittering chandelier that trembled slightly with each gust of wind. Lord Tavisham gestured solemnly. "There, Mr. Holmes." Holloway was seated in that third chair on the left. The guests were arranged clockwise, beginning with my niece Evelyn at my right. I was at the head, and Holloway just to my left. The others were Lord Wilbury, Reverend Palmer, Miss Claiborne, Professor Aldwych, and, of course, Mr. Finch, the composer. Holmes did not reply immediately. He walked with measured steps to the indicated chair and examined it closely. He circled it once, then again, hands clasped behind his back, eyes darting with surgical precision from the chair legs to the table edge, from the carpet weave to the position of the candlesticks. No one moved. Holmes asked suddenly, crouching beside the no one. Tavisham replied. Everyone was frozen with shock. Did Mr. Holloway carry a walking stick? A hat, a coat draped over his chair? No, He'd left his belongings in the vestibule. Holmes tapped the carpet once, then ran a finger along the underside of the chair's armrest. He stood and turned to Harbury, who stood silent in the doorway. "You said the staff has not touched the room." "Not a thing, sir," Harbury replied, "per your instructions." Holmes nodded and walked slowly to the fireplace. He studied the soot patterns, the logs, the narrow brass grate. Then he stepped to the heavy velvet drapes at the far end and examined the windows behind them. I stood quietly to the side, resisting the urge to pace. Holmes was in his element, and I knew better than to interrupt. It was not simply that a man had disappeared. It was the nature of the disappearance that had seized his interest. There were no screams, no struggle, no escape. Only the sudden absence of a man in full speech. Holmes turned toward Tavisham again. How long between Holloway's final word and someone rising to investigate? "Perhaps 10 seconds, the Lord replied. There was a long, stunned pause. Miss Claiborne leaned forward and said, "Mr. Holloway?" And then I rose, but he was gone. Holmes gave a thoughtful nod. "Did you search the house immediately?" "We did, top to bottom." The servants joined in. There are only 3 exits to the house. None of them were disturbed. Windows, all locked from the inside, as were the doors. Holmes returned to the chair and sat in it, mimicking the posture of a guest mid-discussion. So, he was speaking. He said something about Horace. Then he began another line and vanished. What were his exact words? Tavisham furrowed his brow. He said, "Pulvis et umbra sumus." Then he lifted his glass, as if in jest, and began to say, "But consider what he does not say." And that was it. The words stopped mid-air. Holmes frowned, lips twitching faintly. Curious phrasing. Did Holloway seem agitated, nervous, ill at ease? "No," Tavisham replied, quite himself, as far as I could tell. Animated, in fact. He'd been quite charming all evening. Had he left the table at any point? Only once, to use the washroom. He was gone perhaps 5 minutes. Then he returned and resumed his seat. Holmes nodded slowly. "And this washroom, where's it located?" "Down the east corridor, second door." Holmes stood abruptly. "We shall examine it shortly, but first, may I speak with the guests who were present? I've asked them to remain on the estate. They're in the study, awaiting your word." "Excellent," Holmes said. "Watson, take note of each account. The recollections may vary in the smallest of ways, but it is in such margins that truth often hides." As Lord Tavisham excused himself to summon the guests, Holmes turned toward me, his tone low. "This is not an ordinary disappearance, Watson. Either the man was made to vanish through extraordinary means, or he never vanished at all, merely made to appear so. You suspect trickery. I suspect misdirection. Not the theatrical kind, mind you, but something subtle, something intellectual. Holloway was a man of language. Words were his tools. What a better vanishing act than one performed mid-sentence was about to respond when the door opened and the guests began to file in. First came Miss Claiborne, a sharply dressed woman in her 40s, with dark eyes and a disapproving mouth. Behind her was Lord Wilbury, tall and flaxen-haired, followed closely by the stooped Reverend Palmer, who clutched a copy of the Psalms. Then Professor Aldwych, a lean academic with an impatient gait, and finally Mr. Finch, who wore a disheveled frock coat and looked faintly hungover. Each greeted Holmes with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. Holmes, for his part, remained politely neutral. He began with the Reverend. "You sat opposite Mr. Holloway." "Yes, sir." "Did you observe anything unusual about him that evening?" "Not particularly. He was engaged in conversation, quite witty. He and Mr. Finch were debating something language in Scripture, I believe. Did he eat, drink?" "Yes. He had lamb, like the rest of us, and a glass of claret." "Did he seem distracted at any point?" "Only when Lord Tavisham mentioned the old Roman roads. That seemed to strike a nerve." Holmes nodded and continued with the others. Their answers varied only slightly. Miss Claiborne mentioned a faint whistling noise, barely audible, as Holloway vanished. Finch recalled Holloway, adjusting his collar repeatedly. Aldwych complained of a draught from the east wall, but had noticed nothing amiss with Holloway himself. When the questioning was complete, Holmes motioned to me. "Come, Watson. The east corridor awaits. I wish to see where our vanished man last walked alone." As we exited the drawing-room, I glanced back one last time at the chair where Holloway had been seated. It remained as it had the night before, innocently empty. But something about it, the starkness, the absence of any disturbance, unnerved me deeply. The man had vanished mid-sentence, and Sherlock Holmes, for once, was silent. Chapter 3. The First Clues. A scene of deceptions, the east corridor of Tavisham Hall stretched long and narrow, its flagstone floor softened by an aged Persian runner that muffled our steps. Portraits of unsmiling ancestors watched our passage with a grim, faded intensity. Holmes walked ahead with deliberate slowness, his sharp gaze skimming along the skirting boards and up the architraves, pausing briefly at every door and light. "Fixture. This corridor is rarely used," Lord Tavisham had mentioned moments before. The washroom was the only chamber prepared for guests. Holmes stopped before the second door on the right and turned the brass handle. The washroom was small but elegant, white tiling with black marbling, a single frosted window, and a walnut cabinet housing folded linen. Holmes stepped inside and made a slow revolution, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze sweeping the ceiling, the mirror, the tiled floor. "No sign of disorder," I murmured, stepping in after him. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "No fallen water glass, no overturned soap dish, no prints in the dust along the sill." He tapped the window once, locked from the inside. "The hinges are old. Any effort to dislodge them would have made noise, and the latch is undisturbed." I bent to examine the fine porcelain basin. Watermarks suggest recent use, nothing extraordinary. Holmes knelt beside the cabinet and opened it slowly. He ran a finger along the bottom shelf and inspected the cloth on which the toiletries rested. Then he paused. "Observe, Watson," he said, holding up a small object in the palm of his hand, a shaving brush. "Expensive, but this is not the estate's monogram." I took it carefully. The silver handle was engraved with the initials F.H. Felix Holloway, I said. "Indeed. Yet the question is, why bring it to dinner?" He had no travel bag, no visible coat pocket large enough to hold this, and the staff claim he brought nothing but his coat and hat. Holmes tapped the brush gently against the windowsill as though testing its weight. "There's more," he said, his voice low. "Look at the bristles, dry, untouched by water. He brought it, unused, or someone planted it here after he disappeared." I blinked, but why? To confuse us, or to suggest a private moment here that never happened? Holmes replaced the brush with great care, as though setting a playing card in a precise position. Let us retrace his steps. He rose from the dining room and walked here alone. No one followed. He returned after 5 minutes, seemingly unchanged. Then, half an hour later, he vanished. We walked slowly back down the corridor. Holmes's every step measured, his head slightly tilted, as though listening for footsteps in memory. "The floorboards are sound," he muttered. "No trapdoor, no panels in the wall. And yet, Watson, there is something about this hall I dislike. It feels what? Deceptive? Empty," he said, "not just in presence, but in intention, as though it's trying to tell us nothing." We rejoined Lord Tavisham in the library, where Inspector Thackeray had arrived during our absence. A thick-set man in a brown suit, Thackeray had the air of one forced to play host at a card game he did not request. "Mr. Holmes," Thackeray said with a polite nod, "I suppose you've seen the scene. No signs of struggle, no exits. We've confirmed Mr. Holloway never left the premises, not by gate, carriage, or foot." Holmes offered a noncommittal smile. "And yet he is not here." "No, he is not," Thackeray replied. "We've searched the grounds. No footprints in the snow beyond the veranda. No signs of a fall or foul play. Frankly, I believe he staged the entire thing. For what purpose? To escape debt or disgrace? Men have done stranger things to avoid consequence." Holmes held back a smile. "Your theory is neat, but it requires Mr. Holloway to possess a method of vanishing from a room full of observers without moving, smoke, and mirrors." "No smoke," Holmes said, "and no mirrors." Thackeray raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest," Holmes said slowly, "that we learn more about the man himself. What he valued, whom he feared, whom he trusted." The inspector shook his head. "We've checked with the university. No scandals, no political enemies. He was working on a lecture, some ancient dialect, that's all." Holmes turned to Lord Tavisham. Was Holloway himself in good health? Any mention of threats? Anxieties? Tavisham hesitated. "Now that you ask, he did seem wary these last few weeks. He asked peculiar questions about my family vault." Holmes perked up. "Your family vault?" "Yes, our estate chapel contains the Tavisham crypt." He seemed unusually interested in the architecture, particularly the older sections beneath it. I assumed he was being morbid. "And the crypt? Does it have more than one entrance?" Tavisham paused. "Two. One through the other through the servants' cellar. But both are barred and unused." Holmes glanced toward the window. The pale daylight was already beginning to fade behind the fog. "Then I believe it is time we inspected the crypt. You think he might have escaped there?" "I think," Holmes said, "that if Mr. Holloway feared something or someone enough to vanish mid-sentence, he may have had a hiding place in mind all along, as we prepared to leave for the chapel." Holmes paused and turned to me. "Tell me, Watson, do you recall Miss Claiborne's mention of a faint whistling noise just before Holloway disappeared?" "I do." He nodded grimly. "So do I. And it was not the wind." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The Tavisham Estate Chapel stood in solemn isolation beyond the east garden, a structure of weathered gray stone and arched windows, cloaked in ivy and silence. A solitary bell hung dormant in the spire above, and the narrow path that led us there was choked with brown leaves and frost. Holmes walked ahead briskly, his coat collar turned high against the wind, his eyes alight with a deep, crackling curiosity. The chapel doors creaked open with effort, and inside the air was cold, dry, and tinged with the scent of ancient wood and lichen. The pews, though dusty, had been kept in decent order, and a large crucifix loomed over the altar like a silent sentinel. At the far left stood an iron-gated stairwell leading downward. "That leads to the crypt," said Lord Tavisham, who had insisted on joining us for this inspection. He carried a ring of iron keys which he now jangled grimly. "We keep it sealed, no burials in years." Holmes took the keys, selected the appropriate one without hesitation, and unlocked the gate. The iron groaned and a faint draught blew up from below. He descended first, lantern in hand, while I followed close behind. The steps spiraled tightly, rough-hewn and slippery with moss. At the bottom, we emerged into a stoned passage flanked by tombs, heavy, lidded sarcophagi of marble and slate, each bearing the faded names of Tavishams long departed. Holmes moved silently among them, studying every groove and corner with the precision of a man examining a chessboard before his opening move. He stopped at a wall in the farthest alcove, a day to a patch of masonry rougher than the rest. "Recently disturbed," he murmured, brushing away cobwebs to reveal a series of faint chisel marks. "Look, Watson, scraped stone, and here, faint boot marks, smaller than yours, perhaps size 8. Holloway's? Possibly," I said, frowning. "But why come here?" Holmes said nothing. He pressed his hand along the mortar, probing gently, then suddenly drew back. "Ah, hollow behind this portion." He turned to Tavisham. "Is there any record of hidden chambers beneath the chapel?" "None that I'm aware of," the Lord replied, "though my grandfather always said the Tavishams built over something much older." Holmes straightened. "Then I suggest we return here with proper tools, but not yet. We must return to the house. There is more to learn, especially from those who knew Holloway best." Back in the study, Holmes requested that each guest be brought in individually. They arrived with reluctant curiosity, seated one by one across from Holmes in the high-backed leather chair opposite the hearth. Miss Judith Claiborne was first. She wore a brooch shaped like a spider, and her gloved hands rested delicately in her lap. "You were closest to Mr. Holloway emotionally, I believe," Holmes began. Miss Claiborne did not flinch. "I knew him well, yes. We had intellectual companionship." "Did he speak of fears, secrets, projects of unusual character?" She hesitated. "He'd become fixated lately. He mentioned only once words that could unmake meaning. I thought it poetic nonsense, but it seemed to trouble him. Did he explain?" "No, but he referenced a scroll, an ancient one, said it had been miscatalogued in the Bodleian Library for decades." Holmes raised a brow. "Did he name it?" "I believe he called it Fragmentum Noctis, fragment of the night." Holmes made a note. "Thank you, Miss Claiborne." She rose and left. Next came Professor Aldwych, who scoffed at the idea of mystery. Holloway was clever, but fanciful, the professor muttered, always chasing phantoms in old grammar. He once suggested language could alter reality itself, and did you agree? I thought it idiotic. Language reflects reality. It does not command it. But did he seem? Changed, yes. Nervous. He kept referencing a linguistic key, something ancient, dangerous. I dismissed it as academic melodrama. Holmes dismissed Aldwych, and turned his attention to Lord Wilbury next, a stiff man with an immaculately trimmed beard and a sense of inherited certainty. "Holloway and I rarely saw eye to eye," Wilbury said. "He was a scholar. I am a man of land and law. Yet you were present at Lord Tavisham's invitation." I found Holloway irritating, always muttering half-finished thoughts under his breath. Said Latin was only half the cipher, meaningless babble. Did you hear him say anything else the night he disappeared? Something about unspoken intent, but I assumed he was drunk. He left in a huff. Next came Reverend Palmer. A thin man with watery eyes, he seemed hesitant to speak at first, but soon confessed. Holloway confided in me. He feared he had uncovered something not meant for man to know. Holmes leaned forward. What kind of something? He never said plainly, only that language held more than we understood, that beneath ancient roots, Greek, Latin, even older tongues, there were echoes of something unhuman. I shivered involuntarily. Palmer continued, voice hushed. He said one phrase kept recurring, translated loosely as to speak, is to summon. Holmes's expression grew more focused, and he believed this phrase to be, what? A spell? A key? Or a lock? The Reverend was dismissed, leaving only one guest remaining, Mr. Percival Finch, the composer. Finch entered with a languid stride, his eyes red-rimmed, fingers twitching absently as though conducting an invisible symphony. Holloway was brilliant, Finch said, mad, too. He told me words could fold time, like creases in paper, that if you spoke in the right way, using the right rhythm, you could slip through a fold, into the silence between seconds. Holmes said nothing. He watched Finch carefully. He asked me, Finch continued, to compose a tone. A sustained note, barely audible, said it needed to accompany his final lecture. I refused. I thought it madness. What note? Finch smiled faintly. B flat, low, sustained, barely audible, said it helped disengage attention. Holmes scribbled something furiously in his notebook. When Finch departed, Holmes stood, walked to the window, and stared out into the swirling fog. "Well," I asked. "We have our suspects," Holmes murmured, "and one common thread." "What is that?" They each heard Holloway, but none truly listened. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The Red Herring Bee. The following morning, Tavisham Hall was a hive of subdued unease. The fog had thickened overnight, cocooning the estate in a shroud of pale gray that muted even the bird-song. It was within this hush that Inspector Thackeray returned from the nearby village, his expression tight, a folded telegram in hand. "We may have found our man," he said, handing the slip to Holmes. Holmes read it in silence. His brow furrowed slightly, the only betrayal of his thoughts. "What does it say?" I asked. "Holloway," Holmes replied, "was reportedly seen yesterday morning at the Oxford rail station, alone and in haste. The station master swears to it. He even purchased a ticket to London." "But that's impossible," I said. "He disappeared after that." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "If true, it would suggest either a deliberate ruse or an illusion of disappearance." Thackeray folded his arms triumphantly. "I've already wired ahead. If he's gone to ground in London, we'll have him by dusk." Holmes returned the telegram. "Or you'll find a man who only resembles Felix Holloway." Thackeray dismissed the doubt with a wave. "I believe this vanishing was staged, a dramatic escape. The man was frightened, yes, but not by magic. By consequences, Holmes turned to him. Consequences of what?" Thackeray hesitated, then pulled a folded sheaf from his coat. A letter. From Holloway's solicitor, arriving this morning. Holloway had been receiving blackmail notes, threats. He never reported them to the Yard, but they exist, Signed? No, but one contains a line. Cease your inquiries into the night's grammar, or you will be unspoken. I blinked. Unspoken. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That word has surfaced twice now. The inspector nodded. Which brings me to my suspect, Professor Aldwych. On what basis? I asked. He and Holloway had a falling out. A serious one. Witnesses at the Bodleian say they argued in public over some translation. Holmes spoke calmly, the subject of the dispute. A supposed fragment Holloway wanted access to. Aldwych claimed it was misidentified nonsense, but Holloway insisted it was dangerous. The altercation became so heated that Holloway was banned from that section of the archives. Holmes steepled his fingers, and yet Aldwych was present at dinner, rather civil for two men at odds. Not if Aldwych came to silence him, Thackeray replied. This whole vanishing act may be Aldwich's way of removing an academic rival without a corpse. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, let us test your theory. He requested Aldwych be brought to the study again. The professor arrived with visible irritation. "Twice in 2 days," he muttered. "You'll forgive me if I repeat myself." Holmes gestured to a chair. "We understand you and Mr. Holloway had a disagreement at the Bodleian, a professional one. We disagreed on translation methodology. Over what?" "A Babylonian fragment," Aldwych said with a sigh. "A poor one. Cracked, incomplete. Holloway saw patterns where there were none. Did you believe he was dangerous?" "Dangerous? No. Unstable, yes. He believed this fragment, fragmentum noctis, as he so pretentiously called it, contained phonetic structures that could unravel syntax." "Unravel syntax? Render spoken language meaningless? Nonsense. Language is symbolic. It cannot warp the brain by sound alone. But Holloway believed it could. He was obsessed. He claimed there were disruptive syllables, arrangements that mimicked cognition, but carried no semantic payload. He said exposure caused migraines, auditory hallucinations, even blackouts. Did you hear such a phrase? Aldwych looked at him warily. Once, Holloway said it aloud, just a few syllables, sounded like broken Latin. I felt nothing, yet you feared him. Aldwych stiffened. I pitied him, and I warned him. There are lines even lunatics should not cross. Holmes nodded slowly. "Thank you, Professor. That will be all." Aldwych departed with a tight bow. When the door shut, Holmes stood in silence. Then he turned to Thackeray. "You were wrong about Aldwych," the inspector scoffed. "He had motive, knowledge, and opportunity." "He also has too much ego," Holmes said. "If he had truly silenced Holloway, he would not be so quick to belittle his ideas. He would deny them, dismiss them, but not explain them. No, Inspector, Aldwych is a red herring." "Then who?" Thackeray demanded. "Miss Claiborne." Holmes shook his head. She was frightened, but not complicit. Her recollection of the whistling sound is the most honest of all the testimonies. Finch, then, the composer. Holmes paused. He has the temperament and the talent, but no benefit from Holloway's disappearance. He dismissed the theories as fanciful, yet showed no malice. "Then who?" I asked. Holmes's eyes turned inward. "That," he said quietly, "is the question. And until we know more about the fragment, about what Holloway truly feared, we are playing chess without a board." There was a knock at the door. Harbury entered, holding a small wooden box. "Delivered this morning, sir. Addressed to Mr. Holloway, but forwarded here from Oxford." Holmes took the box carefully. It bore a wax seal, cracked but distinct. The symbol was odd, an eye embedded in a spiral. "Watson," Holmes said, "fetch me a knife." I did so. Holmes opened the box with surgical precision. Inside was a folded manuscript, yellowed and brittle, written in two scripts, one Latin, the other utterly alien, comprised of looping glyphs and ink patterns that seemed to resist focus. There was also a note in Holloway's hand, to be opened only if I vanish. Do not read aloud. Do not attempt translation. The words are not dead. They— Wait! Felix H. Holmes closed the box slowly. "Aldwych is not our man," he murmured. "Not yet, but Holloway has left us his trail." "And if we follow it?" I asked. Holmes looked at me, solemn. "Then we must prepare to step into a sentence that may never end." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. The box containing Holloway's final message sat unopened on the table for the better part of an hour. Holmes paced the length of the study in complete silence, hands folded behind his back, while I watched the shifting gray light crawl across the wood-paneled walls like a patient spider. The atmosphere in the room had altered perceptibly since the manuscript's arrival. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the parchment inside that box possessed some subtle gravitational force. "Holmes," I said gently, "you read the note. He said not to read it aloud, not to translate it, but surely you don't believe." "I believe," Holmes interrupted, "that Holloway died or vanished, believing that language, when constructed in a certain form, could do more than merely convey ideas. He believed it could reshape perception." He stopped pacing and turned to face me fully. "And whether or not that belief is sound," he continued, he was terrified. A rational man, with decades of scholarship behind him, does not scribble warnings in his final hours unless he is deeply convinced of a threat. I nodded slowly, understanding his tone. This was not a man being superstitious. This was Holmes respecting a fellow logician's last move. So I asked, "What now?" Holmes took the manuscript and, without opening it, placed it in a metal dispatch box. He snapped the lock shut and turned the key. "We will send it to a man I trust at the British Museum. He'll preserve it, unopened, until we have more context. Not Scotland Yard. Thackeray would burn it or read it aloud over lunch. No, this must be handled delicately." Moments later, Harbury was sent to dispatch the sealed box via private courier, with explicit instructions to ensure it reached London without delay. Holmes, now lighter of step, returned to the hearth and stood with his back to the fire. "Now, Watson, let us revisit the scene, not with eyes for what is there, but for what should be there, and is not." We walked again to the drawing-room, which remained untouched. Holmes scanned the room with a different energy this time. Less exploratory, more comparative. "Here," he said suddenly, pointing to the mantelpiece. "Do you recall the description of Holloway's toast?" "Yes." He raised his glass and began quoting Horace. "Then tell me," Holmes said, "where is his glass?" I blinked. His. Holmes pointed to the table. "Each guest has a wine-glass before them, except his chair, empty. Could it have been cleared away?" "No." Lord Taversham swore the staff had not touched the room. We examined the area. There were no shards on the floor, no ring where a glass might have rested. "It's gone," I muttered. "And that," Holmes said quietly, is our inconsistency. Looked back at the chair, then at the untouched place setting. If Holloway raised a glass and disappeared mid-sentence, and no one moved, then the glass should still be here. But it is not. Therefore, someone did move. But we were told no one rose. Indeed, Holmes said, crouching beside the chair. And perhaps that is true from their perspective. But what if the disappearance created a momentary lapse, seconds of confusion unaccounted for? A breath of disorientation, into which a careful hand might have reached. He stood and turned toward the fireplace. I would wager that the person who removed the glass was seated nearby, close enough to act quickly, but far enough to avoid direct scrutiny. You suspect someone tampered with the scene? Do. And I suspect they hoped we would not notice what was missing amidst all that remained. We returned to the list of seating positions, as recalled by Lord Tavisham. Holloway had been seated to his left. Closest to him were Professor Aldwych and Miss Claiborne. Miss Claiborne mentioned the whistling, I recalled. And Aldwych downplayed everything, Holmes said. But neither of them would risk removing the glass so openly, unless they had cover. He paused. Watson, do you recall Finch's hands? His hands? They trembled, Holmes said, twitching fingers conducting invisible music. I thought it a nervous habit. But what if he was recalling the timing of something, precise, a moment practiced beforehand? You think Finch removed the glass? I think he did something more intricate, something requiring rehearsal. We found Finch in the music room, seated at a grand piano with his back to us, gently pressing the same key, B-flat, over and over, so softly the note barely registered. Mr. Finch, Holmes said without preamble, what did you do with Holloway's glass? Finch's hand froze on the key. He turned slowly. I beg your pardon. After the disappearance, Holmes continued, you removed it quietly. No one else noticed, perhaps not even you at first, but I believe Holloway's glass is now missing, and only someone with a performer's precision could have acted in those seconds of confusion. Finch's mouth twitched. I didn't mean harm, he said softly. I only meant to help. Help whom? Holloway, Finch replied. He asked me to keep his notes safe. He feared someone at the table, someone who didn't believe in what he'd discovered. I saw the glass teeter just for a moment. Then he was gone. And the glass? I took it. Reflex. I didn't want them to think it had shattered, that he'd fallen ill. It didn't feel real. I wiped it and hid it in the conservatory. Holmes's expression softened. You were frightened. Yes, because I think he succeeded. I think he really left. Holmes stepped forward, and the tone you played during dinner, the B-flat, you sustained it on the harmonium. Why? Holloway said it was important, that it prepared the mind. I didn't understand, but he was my friend. Holmes studied him for a long moment. Then, where are the rest of his notes? Finch reached into his coat and produced a small, leather-bound journal. Holmes accepted it carefully, then nodded once. You will say nothing of this for now. Do you understand? Finch nodded as we exited into the hall once more. Holmes looked down at the journal and said almost to himself, the glass was missing, the sound was deliberate, and the manuscript was only part of the equation. Something more subtle happened in that room, Watson, something designed or composed. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The journal given to Holmes by Percival. Finch was compact but dense, its pages scribbled in a neat angular hand that betrayed both haste and precision. We returned to Holmes's temporary quarters in the Taversham Hall guest wing, and he sat by the fire with the volume propped on his knee, thumbing through it with the care of a surgeon approaching exposed nerves. The entries were fragmentary. Some no more than isolated words or phonetic symbols. Others, entire paragraphs written in Latin, Greek, or unfamiliar hybridizations of the two. At the top of one page, Holloway had written in underlined English, "We do not listen, not truly." Language has structure, yes, but beneath that structure is vibration, resonance. It is not the meaning that shapes thought, but the shape that manipulates perception. Holmes muttered the words aloud and closed the book gently. "Watson," he said, "we are dealing with a man who believed that meaning was a side effect of form, that the sound of a sentence, not its logic, could distort the mind." I leaned closer. "That sounds almost mystical. Or mathematical," Holmes corrected. "A code based not on letters, but on pitch and pattern." Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Harbury entered, his face pale. "Inspector, Thackeray requests your presence, sir. There's been another incident." We followed the valet to the rear of the estate, where the snow had melted slightly under the morning sun, revealing the edge of the west garden. There, in the open air beneath a barren tree, a stable hand named Connor lay face down in the mud. "Inspector," Thackeray stood with arms crossed, flanked by 2 constables who had arrived earlier that morning. A doctor from the village knelt beside the body, rising as we approached. "Dead from shock, most likely," he said. "No wounds, no bruising, eyes wide open." Holmes knelt and examined the corpse. The young man's expression was frozen in terror, his mouth slightly open as if in mid-scream. "What was he doing here?" Holmes asked. Thackeray gestured toward a small iron grate set into the garden wall. He had been assigned to clear debris from the old ventilation shafts, part of the original crypt airways, sealed off for decades. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Had he opened them? Not yet, just cleared ivy and stones. Holmes turned to the grate. It was no more than 2 feet wide, set low with iron bars and a crumbling frame. But as he approached, he stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that, Watson?" I listened. At first nothing, but then faint, almost below hearing, a soft, constant hum. "Like a tuning fork," I whispered. Holmes nodded grimly. "Low B flat, again." Finch's tone. Holmes turned sharply. "Close this area immediately. No one approaches that grate. No one." Thackeray frowned. "You think the sound killed him? I think it called something. Or rather, it disrupted something." He returned to the body and knelt again, examining the man's collar. There, tucked between fabric and skin, was a small scrap of paper. Holmes extracted it carefully and unfolded it. On it was a symbol, like the one from the manuscript seal, an eye within a spiral, this time hand-drawn, with looping lines radiating outward. No text, no message. Holmes stood and motioned me away. "From the others, this symbol is not a threat," he murmured. "It is a reminder, a signature." "Of whom?" "Of the one who understands the pattern, who uses the tone. You think someone is testing this theory?" Holmes nodded. "Finch said he refused to compose the full piece. But what if someone else did?" My mind reeled. But who would? Someone with knowledge and access. Someone who remained quiet at dinner. He looked back toward the house. Claiborne, he said at last. She knew Holloway's terminology. She spoke of the scroll, the manuscript, and the phrase to be unspoken. But she feared him, I said. She was nervous, jittery. Perhaps that was guilt. Later that afternoon, Holmes requested a private interview with Miss Claiborne. She arrived to the study dressed in black, her manner guarded but not defiant. "You removed yourself from others after the dinner," Holmes said without preamble. "I was upset. By Holloway's disappearance, yes, or by its success." She blinked, then steadied herself. "What are you suggesting?" "That Holloway did not vanish by accident," Holmes replied. "That someone helped him or tried to replicate the phenomenon after him. That someone understood the theory behind it." She was silent. "Why did you really come to the dinner?" he pressed. "You weren't invited by Lord Tavisham. Holloway asked you personally." She hesitated. "He wanted to show me something, a demonstration. He believed he was on the verge of breaking through. He said, I was the only one who would understand the danger." "And did you?" Her voice dropped. "He believed that to speak a sentence backwards, using the same structure, the same tone, but with meaning inverted, was the key. Not the phrase itself, but the intent reversed. He called it the negative imperative." Holmes tilted his head. "And did he attempt it?" She swallowed. "He began to. He whispered part of it during our walk before dinner. I felt disoriented, as though my thoughts no longer aligned. And afterward I begged him not to do it at the table. He laughed, said no one would believe it anyway." Holmes leaned forward. "And yet you believed?" She nodded once. "Yes." Studied her face carefully. "Then tell me, who else believed?" She hesitated, then said in a whisper, "Professor Aldwych. He believed more than anyone else, but not because he feared it, because he wanted to control it." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Then I fear," he said, rising from his chair, "the crime is not yet over." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory of storm had been building all afternoon, and by dusk it broke over Tavisham Hall in a downpour that battered the leaded windows and turned the gravel paths to blackened mire. Thunder rumbled overhead, low and continuous, like the groaning of some massive buried machine. It was under this oppressive canopy that Sherlock Holmes prepared his first true experiment. He stood in the drawing-room once more, now cleared, of its guests and servants, gazing at the very chair from which Felix Holloway had disappeared. The table had been returned to its original position, the candles trimmed and lit, casting long swaying shadows across the chamber. Holmes had placed a metronome beside Holloway's chair, its tick-tick-tick providing a steady pulse, unnatural in the room's silence. "I trust," Holmes said, glancing at me, "that you've brought the items I requested." I opened the satchel I had retrieved from Holmes's trunk and produced the following: a phonograph with a fresh wax cylinder, a tuning fork, precisely calibrated to B-flat A, reproduction of Holloway's seating position, drawn from Holmes's own, sketch, and lastly, a single red wine glass. Holmes nodded. "Perfect. Now we begin." He turned to Inspector Thackeray, who had arrived, despite his irritation, still skeptical of Holmes's current line of reasoning. "This, I assume, will be another performance?" the inspector asked dryly. "A demonstration," Holmes replied, "not for spectacle, but for calibration. If my suspicions are correct, the environment of the disappearance was no accident. It was constructed, down to timing, tone, and syntax. You still believe language caused him to vanish? Holmes gave him a measured look. I believe that someone believed it could, and arranged the conditions to exploit that belief. Whether it resulted in actual disappearance, hypnosis, or deception remains to be tested. Holmes handed me the journal Finch had provided. Watson, turn to page 34. I did. There, written in Holloway's precise script, was a single line of symbols, phonetic, unfamiliar but distinctly structured. That, Holmes said, was the phrase Holloway spoke the night he vanished, or at least the phonetic construct of it. He took the tuning fork and struck it lightly against the fireplace grate. A low, sustained B-flat filled the room. Holmes stood behind the empty chair and faced it, reciting the phrase under his breath, while I recorded it onto the wax cylinder. The metronome ticked in perfect measure. When Holmes finished, the room held its breath. Nothing happened. Thackeray smirked. Well, Mr. Holmes, the man remains absent. But Holmes didn't reply. He stepped forward and picked up the wine-glass from the table. He held it up to the candlelight and turned it slowly. There's residue on this glass, he murmured. A fine film, not wine, not dust, something granular. He dipped a finger and smelled it, then tasted it with the lightest tap of his tongue. Peppermint, he said, infused with laudanum. Holloway's drink was altered. Drugged? I asked. Yes, but subtly, enough to impair clarity, induce slight dissociation. He was disoriented before he spoke the phrase. That may have made him more suggestible. Suggestible to what? To the idea that speaking it would work, that he would vanish, a self-fulfilling delusion, or perhaps a vulnerability to someone else's plan. Thackeray folded his arms. So someone drugged him. Why not just remove him after that? Because the illusion had to be witnessed, Holmes replied. His disappearance needed to be seen to be believed. This was not about removing Holloway. This was about proving something. To us. To himself. And now, he added, walking to the phonograph, we test the rest of the scene. He reset the wax cylinder and struck the tuning fork again. The B-flat hummed. Then he played the recording of his earlier incantation. As the room filled with the sound of Holloway's mimicry, the same phrase, spoken in the same cadence, over the same tone. Something in the air shifted. The candle flames flickered. The metronome stuttered. I felt, for a brief instant, as though I had left my body, as though I was watching myself watch the room. Then the cylinder ended. The tone faded, and everything was still. Holmes exhaled deeply. A perceptual phenomenon, induced by sound and suggestion. Temporary dissociation. You mean we were hypnotized? I asked, in a manner of speaking, but more precise. This was not hypnosis. It was a formula, built on resonance, semantics, and the subtle interplay of belief. He turned toward the door, which means someone else understands this formula, someone besides Holloway. I stepped closer. Claiborne, said Aldwych, was the one to fear. Yes, Holmes said softly, but she never admitted how much she knew. That was her game. He turned to Thackeray. Have her watched quietly. Do not confront her. Why? Because I believe she's not the architect of this scheme, but a collaborator. And the architect? I asked. Holmes stared at the empty chair once more. That, Watson, he said, we will discover when they attempt to recreate the performance. Because they will. Lightning flashed at the window. followed by a crack of thunder that shook the panes. And for a moment, just a moment, I imagined Holloway still seated there, caught between the tick of the metronome and the low hum of the tuning fork, forever suspended mid-sentence. Chapter 9. A second attempt, the culprit strikes again, and storm raged well into the night, and the halls of Tavisham Hall felt narrower, darker, as if the house itself had begun to draw inward. The fire sputtered in the drawing-room hearth. Candles guttered in the draughts that crept beneath doors. Even the staff had grown hushed, their usual deference replaced by something heavier. Fear, or its quieter cousin, foreboding. Sherlock Holmes did not sleep. I found him at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the library, hunched over a sheaf of Holloway's notes and a blank piece of staff-lined manuscript paper. A single candle illuminated the surface of the desk. Holmes's eyes glittered in the gloom, tracing invisible patterns in the margin. "You've heard it, Watson," he said without looking up. "The phrase, the tone. You felt it too." I nodded slowly. Yes, like stepping out of time for a moment. Holmes leaned back in the chair and folded his hands. "That's not hypnotism. It's not suggestion alone. It's intentional design. Someone orchestrated the entire dinner like a composition, and someone will try again." Soon the door burst open with sudden urgency. Harbury entered, his hair soaked, his boots splashed with mud. His face was drained of all color. "Sir," he gasped, "it's Miss Claiborne." Holmes was on his feet at once. They found her in the music room. The room itself was a study in calm. The grand piano sat untouched. A single lamp still glowed by the wall, but on the floor, crumpled beside the piano stool, lay Judith Claiborne. She was alive, but barely. Her hands trembled violently. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, and her eyes flitted from corner to corner of the ceiling, as though tracking something no one else could see. Holmes knelt beside her. "Judith," he said, voice low, "what did you hear?" Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Then finally, a whisper. It was him, but not him, speaking backwards through the silence. Holmes looked up sharply. "Who?" She opened her mouth again and screamed. The cry echoed through the chamber like a struck bell. Thackeray, who had just arrived, took a cautious step back. "She's cracked," he said. "No," Holmes replied, rising slowly. "She's been overloaded." Her perception was destabilized, likely by a second phrase, similar to Holloway's, but altered, stronger. I turned toward the piano and stopped short. There, resting neatly on the stool, was a sheet of music, fresh ink, crisp parchment. At the top, a title in careful script, Lamento. Per una voce non più. Lament for a voice no more. Composed by P. Finch Holmes took the sheet in hand, scanning it quickly, his brow furrowed. "Watson," he murmured, "see here. The notes are spaced irregularly. At first glance it resembles standard composition, but look closely. Some measures are asymmetric. They match the phonetic cadence of Holloway's journal. It's not music, it's notation for speech." "Then Finch lied," I said. Holmes's face darkened. Or worse, he changed his mind, left Miss Claiborne in the care of a maid, and made our way to the west wing, where Finch's quarters were housed. The storm had not relented. The corridors moaned with every gust of wind. When we reached the door, Holmes knocked. No response. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the room was empty. A fire had burned itself low in the grate. The bed was undisturbed. A sheet of paper lay on the desk, folded in half. Holmes opened it carefully. It was a letter to whomever. Finds this, I could not resist. He was right. Holloway was right. There is a structure in the sound. Not music, not language. Something between. The phrase is incomplete, but the rest lies in the tunnels. Beneath the crypt, I must try it. He called it the sentence that ends the listener. If I fail, seal the passage. P.F. Holmes exhaled slowly. Then we're too late. He's gone into the tunnels. We roused Tavisham and 2 footmen and made for the chapel in the dead of night. Rain poured in torrents and lightning painted the chapel in ghastly white flashes. Holmes led the way down into the crypt, lantern swinging in one hand, the other gripping the cold steel of his revolver. We descended the stone stair, past the old sarcophagi, and into the narrow tunnel Holmes had marked days earlier. The hidden mortar wall had been pushed aside. Someone had uncovered an ancient passage long buried beneath centuries of family stone. The air grew colder, damper. We pressed forward in silence until we saw it, a figure ahead. Standing. Finch, he, stood in a domed chamber beneath the earth, surrounded by concentric lines of carved stone, holding a sheet of music in one hand and a tuning fork in the other. His eyes were fixed on the far wall, where symbols had been etched in some archaic scrawl. Holmes raised his voice. Finch. The man did not move. Then he began to speak, not loudly, not frantically, but in a soft, rhythmic voice, utterly calm. The tone beneath his words was audible. It hummed, vibrated, filled the air with a pressure that made the hairs on my arms rise. Vox sub umbra temporis. Holmes surged forward. Stop. Finch turned and smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Too late, he said, and then he dropped the tuning fork. The sound that followed was not a crash. It was a silence, a perfect ringing silence, and in that moment Finch was no longer there, only the echo of the phrase he had not finished. Holmes stood still, eyes closed, listening. I have it, he said quietly, the missing piece. He just gave it to us. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The chamber beneath Tavisham Hall remained still long after Finch disappeared. The air, thick with damp and the residue of sound, hummed faintly in our ears, like the aftershock of a bell that refused to fade. Holmes stood at the center of the circle, etched into the stone floor, staring at the spot where Finch had last stood. Not a trace of him remained. The only sound was our own breath. I've seen vanishings, Holmes said softly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile, escapes illusions. But this, Watson, this borders on the metaphysical. You think he's dead? No, Holmes said, kneeling slowly. Or rather, not yet. I believe he has stepped between, not through trickery or sleight of hand, but by completing what Holloway began. This is no simple disappearance. It is a transfer. To where? Holmes touched the etched lines on the floor. That, my dear Watson, is the question. Not where, but why. He stood again and examined the surrounding walls. The ancient markings spiraled outward, part of a larger geometric design, intersecting with precisely placed niches in the stone. The architecture did not match the chapel above. It was older, much older Roman, perhaps even pre-Roman, carved with a purpose that had long since been buried under time and superstition. He turned to me. Finch was not just a participant. He was a believer, and he was invited. Invited? By whom? Holmes didn't answer. He approached the back wall and ran his fingers over a symbol carved at shoulder height, the spiral eye. The architect of this sequence, Holmes murmured, understood that disappearance was not enough. Holloway's vanishing was a test, a proof of concept, but the true aim, the final performance, was meant to follow. He stepped away and motioned for Thackeray, who had stood silent until now. His skepticism slowly eroded into grim silence. Have 2 constables seal this chamber. No one enters until I return. No one touches anything. Thackeray hesitated. Where will you go? To Oxford, Holmes said. Holloway's research was based on manuscripts found at the Bodleian, but his theory, this theory, was seeded long before. We need to find the seed. By midday, we were aboard the northbound train, the morning mist rising like smoke over the rolling countryside. Holmes was silent for most of the journey, his eyes fixed on the journal, the symbols, the folding of form and meaning. He traced the lines as one might trace a familiar melody, hesitating at certain intervals, repeating others. I watched him for a long while before breaking the silence. Holmes, I said, you believe this was all orchestrated. I believe, he replied, that someone used language not as a medium of communication, but as an architecture, an edifice of sound. Holloway theorized it. Finch executed it, but someone else planned it. And Holloway feared that someone. Yes, but not enough to stop. He couldn't. For him, knowledge wasn't just discovery. It was descent into something ancient. He leaned forward. Watson, what if the earliest languages weren't designed to explain the world, but to interact with it? I frowned. You mean spells? Holmes gave a thin smile. Not spells. Systems like code. A syntax that modifies not the mind, but the frame of perception. Finch didn't disappear because he was tricked. He disappeared because he completed the equation. The Bodleian Library rose before us like a cathedral of silence. Within, the Special Collections curator, a wizened man named Elmsley, led us to a secure reading chamber, where a bundle of documents had been laid out in anticipation of our arrival. These are the papers Holloway requested repeatedly, Elmsley explained. We denied full access due to their condition and questionable content. He viewed what he could under supervision, but he often left shaking. Holmes studied the fragments. Ancient vellum, blackened by time, covered in markings somewhere between script and sound notation. Many pages bore the spiral eye motif. One page in particular caught Holmes's attention. A circular diagram, words orbiting a central phrase, lingua umbrae, the tongue of the shadow. Beneath it, written in English by Holloway's own hand, the etior phrase is not meant to be spoken. It is meant to be understood by the body. The voice is only the vessel. The meaning is in the resonance. Good God, I breathed. Holmes's gaze sharpened. There, he said, pointing to the margin. That annotation, P.A., those are not Holloway's initials. Professor Aldwych, I said. Holmes nodded slowly. Then we found our architect. We returned to Tavisham that evening, only to find Inspector Thackeray waiting, in the drawing room, his expression grave. He's gone, the inspector said. Who? Aldwych packed a bag left by carriage before we received your message to detain him. His rooms are empty. Holmes's face did not change. Then the final move is near. He turned to the window, watching the wind tear through the trees. This was never about power or fame, he said. It was about control. Aldwych wants to prove that thought itself can be reshaped, that perception is malleable through language. He sees himself not as a criminal, but as a composer of reality. "Then what's his endgame?" I asked. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable, to complete the sentence. "The true one. The one that not only silences, but replaces." Chill ran through me. "Then how do we stop him?" Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "We write our own ending before he writes us out of it." Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes's Grand Strategy. For 3 days, Sherlock Holmes said almost nothing. He rose early, sat for long hours with Holloway's journal, Finch's notations, and the Bodleian fragments spread before him on the table in the study. His violin lay untouched in its case. His tobacco went stale in its pouch. Even his appetite diminished to brief mechanical sips of tea. At night, I heard him pacing above my room. Slow, steady footsteps punctuated by long silences, as though listening to the walls. On the 4th morning, he rang for me. "Watson," he said, "Aldwych is preparing for something. A final utterance, one that does not require his presence here at Tavisham, because the architecture for its reception is already complete." I frowned. "You mean the chamber beneath the chapel?" Holmes nodded. That was his canvas. The guests, the sequence of sounds, even Holloway's vanishing. It was all a rehearsal. But what he intends now will not end in disappearance. Then what? "Displacement," Holmes said grimly. "He aims to overwrite, to impose a new semantic structure into the minds of everyone exposed to it, the spoken phrase as weaponized architecture." I sat, trying to piece together what that meant. But he's fled. Only in appearance. Aldwych is too vain to leave the final act unwitnessed. He will return, not as the performer, but as the conductor. And to lure him, Watson, we must offer him a stage. By midday, Holmes had summoned Lord Tavisham, Inspector Thackeray, and Harbury to the chapel. There, by lantern light, and beneath centuries of stone, Holmes revealed his plan. "We will host another dinner," he said, "identical to the last. Same seating, same room, same timing. This time the guests are informed, the roles rehearsed. This time we control the tempo." "You mean to set a trap?" Tavisham asked. "A chamber," Holmes corrected. "Not to silence Aldwych, but to expose him. We let him believe his performance will complete unopposed, but we intercept the final movement." Thackeray rubbed his chin. "How will he know to return?" "He already does," Holmes said. "This house hums with his creation. The chamber below still pulses faintly. He believes it is ready. He believes we are ignorant of his notation. But we now know the grammar." Holmes motioned for me to retrieve a scroll from the side table. "I've reconstructed a defensive counterphrase, a sentence of reversal, one spoken not to vanish, but to break the recursive loop of the original sequence. If delivered correctly, it should destabilize his control." "And who will speak this?" asked Tavisham. "I will," Holmes said, "at the precise moment Aldwych begins his phrase." "You'll risk your mind?" I asked. He met my gaze squarely. "Better mine than yours." The night of the second dinner arrived with uncanny symmetry. Mist rolled once again across the hay. Tavisham grounds, the gas lamps flickered in the cold wind, and a fire crackled in the drawing-room hearth. The table was reset, the same wine decanted, the same seats filled, with the exception of Finch and Holloway. In their places, 2 discreet agents from the yard sat silently, feigning nervousness and sipping at water. Miss Claiborne had recovered, enough to return. Her eyes, however, bore the memory of something seen beyond language. She sat near Holmes and said nothing. At exactly 8 o'clock, Holmes stood. "I propose a toast," he said, raising his glass, "to words unspoken and to those who dare to listen." He sat, the room waited, and then he arrived, not through the front door, not announced, but in the hallway. Professor Aldwych stepped into the drawing-room like a man walking onto a stage. He had built himself. He was dressed in a dark frock coat, gloves tucked into his belt, and a look in his eyes that no longer seemed academic. It was closer to religious awe. "You're late," Holmes said. "Am I?" Aldwych replied, "I believe I am exactly on time." The guests froze, but as instructed, remained seated. Thackeray, standing by the wall, slipped a hand into his coat, but Holmes gave the faintest shake of his head. Aldwych smiled. "I never intended to harm Holloway," he said. "He invited it, yearned for it. And Finch, he was a willing participant. But they were not ready. They believed too much in meaning. I see only pattern." He stepped into the center of the room. "This room," he said, "is a chamber of harmonic balance. You reconstructed it beautifully, Mr. Holmes. The spiral etched below us completes the waveform. When I speak, the sound will resonate, not only here, but in the minds of those who have heard the first phrase." He drew from his coat a slim strip of parchment and began to speak. Holmes rose instantly. He countered not with volume, but with precision. The reversal phrase flowed from him like liquid steel, carefully measured, each syllable placed exactly opposite the rhythm of Aldwich's incantation. The moment the two sentences collided in the air, a pressure wave struck the room. The lights dimmed, the guests clutched the table, Thackeray fell to one knee, and then, a sound like cracking glass, Aldwych stumbled. His parchment fell from his hand, curling in the firelight. His voice faltered. You interrupted the frame," he said hoarsely. Holmes did not stop. He finished the phrase. With the final syllable, the spiral on the floor seemed to recede, as though the geometry of the room had snapped back into alignment. Aldwych collapsed, unconscious. Silence returned. Later that night, Holmes sat once more by the fire. A constable stood guard at Aldwich's door. The spiral chamber was resealed. The guests had been escorted away. "You risked everything," I said quietly. Holmes looked at me, eyes unreadable. "I risked language, Watson, that's all." "And did it work?" He stared into the flames, for now. Then he held up the burnt scrap of Aldwich's parchment, half consumed. "What worries me," he said, "is that this was not the final phrase." He let the ash crumble into the fire. It was a translation. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. Fire in the hearth crackled low, casting long fingers of light across the floor of the study, where Sherlock Holmes remained seated, his gaze lost in the dying embers. Outside, the wind clawed at the windows with the persistence of a beggar refused entry. Inside, the storm had stilled. For the moment, I sat across from Holmes, his last words ringing in my mind. "A translation, Watson. That's what Aldwych used. A phonetic rendering of an older phrase, one he did not invent." "And that means?" I asked. Holmes raised his eyes slowly, as though returning from a great distance. "It means we've been chasing an echo, not the source." Aldwych fancied himself the composer of a new grammar of control, but he was merely a scribe. He didn't create the pattern. He only found it. Then who did? Holmes stood, walked to the desk, and unfurled the remaining pages of Holloway's journal. He spread them wide across the surface, then placed Finch's notations beside them. Slowly, with great care, he overlaid certain pages, translucent parchment atop ink-stained vellum, aligning fragments of symbol, curve, and cadence. And then I saw it. What had appeared random, disjointed, maddeningly obscure, suddenly formed a singular shape, a spiral intersected by a line of evenly spaced marks, each connected to a symbol, repeated only once throughout all the texts. Holmes tapped the center of the diagram. There, that is the origin, the core phrase. The sentence both Holloway and Aldwych danced around, but never reached. The true sound sentence that ends the listener. Or, as Holloway called it, lingua umbrae, the tongue of the shadow. I stared, but it was never spoken. Holmes's eyes narrowed. No, and that's what preserved them. Both believed the sentence's power lay in the utterance. But Holloway, brilliant as he was, failed to see the true danger. He turned the last page of Holloway's notes, revealing a passage we had previously dismissed as academic rambling. Now, with context, it struck me like ice. It is not sound that binds, it is understanding. The shadow does not speak, it listens, and what it hears, it replicates. That is the end, not silence, but replacement. Holmes spoke the final word aloud. Replacement. You mean it's not a curse or disappearance? It's a substitution? He nodded precisely. Not the vanishing of self, but the insertion of something else. A new pattern overlaid on the canvas of identity. Finch didn't disappear. Holloway didn't vanish. They were reformatted. A chill ran through me. Then the phrase, doesn't kill. No, Holmes said. It rewrites. He stepped back from the table and stood silently for a moment. Then, I must see the crypt again. We descended into the earth beneath Tavisham Hall once more. The lantern flickered as we passed the sealed spiral chamber, where Aldwich's final performance had failed. Holmes, however, ignored the room entirely. Instead, he traced the passage leading deeper, the part we had never entered, sealed behind a fallen beam and rubble. We assumed the architecture ended here, he said, but Holloway's notes described multiple harmonic nodes, chambers built not for burial, but for resonance. That means there must be a second structure. With Thackeray's men, we cleared the passage, moving ancient stones one by one until we reached a narrow archway, choked in roots and black soil. Holmes passed through first, then paused. "Watson," he said slowly, "bring the light." I followed him into a smaller chamber, circular, domed and carved from the same pre-Roman stone. But unlike the spiral room, this one had no markings. Only a single object sat in the center, a stone pedestal, atop which rested an obsidian mirror. Holmes approached it with great caution. "Do you see?" he whispered. I did, not at first, but as I looked closer, I noticed the reflection. Not mine, not Holmes's. The mirror showed only the room, but in the center, where the pedestal stood, there was a figure, blurred, unmoving. "Holmes," I said, my voice unsteady. "That's Finch," he confirmed. "Or what remains," I staggered back. "But how? How can a reflection show someone not present?" Holmes stepped forward, eyes locked on the glass, because the sentence did complete not through voice, but through design. The spiral chamber was the broadcast. This. He pointed at the mirror. Is the receiver? I turned away, shaken. Then, Holloway, he's here. In part. So is Finch. Holmes bent to inspect the pedestal. Etched around its base was the spiral eye motif. But at the very bottom, carved with the finest precision, was a name. Arx Volocris spoke it aloud. Holmes froze. Watson, say that again. Arx Volocris. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The Tower of the Voice. The central structure in Holloway's earliest map. I assumed it was a metaphor, but it's real. Holmes stood. Not here, elsewhere. The sentence was only a fragment of a larger transmission. The origin lies beyond this chamber, beyond Tavisham, and Aldwych was merely its most recent echo. I swallowed hard. Then, this isn't over. No, Holmes said, turning to the exit. It has only just begun. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. We emerged from the hidden chamber beneath. Tavisham Hall, well after midnight. The storm had passed, leaving a leaden stillness over the estate. Not a breath stirred the trees. Not a single bird sang in the thickets. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural, as though the world itself had paused to listen. Holmes said little as we returned to the study, his expression carved from stone. He moved with quiet urgency, laying out notes, scrolls, and diagrams across the desk, as though assembling a final puzzle, whose pieces were dissolving even as he touched them. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice hushed. Holmes looked up. "We prepare for his escape." "You mean Aldwych?" "He's still unconscious." Holmes gave the faintest shake of his head. "No, he's pretending." I stiffened. "You're sure?" "As sure as I am that he's memorized the original phrase. His manuscript was merely the carrier. The true sentence, lingua umbrae, is now within him. The moment he regains enough strength to speak it aloud, he will attempt to escape not just this house, but the bounds of meaning." A knock interrupted us. It was Thackeray, his face tense. "You were right," he said grimly. "The constable, on duty outside Aldwich's room, knocked unconscious, and Aldwych is gone." Holmes rose in a flash. "How long ago?" "Minutes, no more. We've locked down the house, but he could still be inside." "No," Holmes said. "He's not running out. He's running down." We took to the chapel at once, lanterns in hand. The crypt door had been forced open, the spiral chamber below once again disturbed. The dust on the floor bore fresh prints, one set, deliberate and slow. Holmes studied the path. "He's going back to the mirror, the receiver chamber." "Why?" I asked. "To vanish." "No, to complete the message. He believes the chamber isn't just a receiver. He thinks it's a gateway, a place where meaning can be transmitted." We followed the trail back through the narrow corridor, past the broken beams and into the circular room. The mirror still sat upon its pedestal, black and undisturbed. But Aldwych was there. He stood before the mirror, arms raised, his back to us. "Don't speak," Holmes whispered urgently. "Not a word." We crept closer, Thackeray at my side, revolver drawn. But Aldwych was already in motion. He turned, smiling faintly. Not with joy, but with certainty. "You followed," he said, "as I knew you would." Holmes stepped forward, calm and clear. "Aldwych, the sentence you're about to speak, it will not free you. It will consume you." "No," Aldwych replied. "It will reveal me." He raised his hands again, and from his lips came the beginning of the phrase, the same cadence Holloway had once spoken, but this time more refined, more precise. The very air seemed to tighten, the stone walls bending inward, though they remained. Still, Holmes didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small, unassuming object, a tuning fork. He struck it against the stone, softly. A low B-flat rang out. Aldwych staggered. Holmes advanced. The sentence was never meant to be spoken in isolation, he said. It was meant to be resisted. The mirror is not a transmitter. It's a filter, a fail-safe. Aldwych roared the second line of the phrase. The chamber began to hum. I felt a sharp pressure in my ears, like a scream on the edge of hearing. The mirror flickered, and then Holmes shouted a phrase of his own, a reversal he had crafted, drawn from Holloway's journal. Refined in the hours since our last descent. The mirror pulsed once, twice, then fractured. The obsidian cracked clean. Down the center, Aldwych shrieked, not in pain, but in disbelief. "No," he hissed. "You don't understand. The final sentence is already written. It's in all of us. You cannot stop it." Holmes raised the tuning fork again and brought it down upon the pedestal. With a resonant crack, the pedestal split. The spiral eye symbol fractured. The mirror fell and shattered into dust. Aldwych collapsed. The hum stopped. The room fell into utter silence. Back in the drawing room, hours later, Holmes sat quietly, eyes closed. Aldwych had been restrained and sedated, placed under constant guard, and removed from the premises by Scotland Yard's highest authorities. The manuscript fragments, the music sheets, and the mirror shards had been sealed in lead boxes and marked for the deepest archives of the British Museum. "What happens now?" I asked. Holmes opened his eyes. "The danger has passed." He stood and walked to the window. Morning was breaking at last. A pale blue light bled across the horizon, but not the question. "What question?" He turned to me, the faintest trace of weariness in his voice. If language can rewrite thought, if sound can shape perception, then what other sentences lie buried, waiting to be spoken? He tapped the windowsill with one long finger. And who will listen? Chapter 14. Holmes closes. In the final clue revealed. The events at Tavisham Hall had shaken even the most rational minds among us. Yet Sherlock Holmes remained unusually still in the aftermath. For 2 full days following the collapse of the spiral chamber and Aldwich's failed invocation, Holmes spoke very little. He neither accepted new cases nor answered telegrams. Instead, he sat by the library window, revisiting the scattered remnants of Holloway's notes, and staring for long hours at the faint spiral, now permanently scorched, into the surface of the broken tuning fork. It was on the 3rd morning, as I poured tea, that he finally stirred with a quiet, measured breath. "Watson," he said, "we have been looking at this all backward." I set down the teapot. "Backward?" He gestured toward the open pages of the journal. We believed the sentence, the lingua umbrae, was the culmination, the apex of this linguistic descent. But what if it was not a creation at all? What if it was a recovery? He turned the final pages of Holloway's manuscript again, then brought out the transcript from the Bodleian, a translation of the fragmented proto-text. "These are not instructions," Holmes murmured. "They are records, and they speak of something that predates our alphabet, our syntax, even our sense of linear meaning. You think the sentence was discovered, not devised?" Holmes nodded. Aldwych and Holloway both believed they were unearthing power, an ancient weapon hidden in forgotten phonemes. But what if they simply rediscovered a linguistic contagion? A sequence of meaning so structurally perfect that it replicates itself through thought. He handed me a page filled with looping notations. The symbols repeat not just in sound, but in form. Symmetry across multiple dimensions of perception, auditory, visual, conceptual. It's not a sentence, Watson. It's a mimetic virus. I blinked. A thought that spreads like a disease. Holmes gave a tight nod. And it does not require belief, only exposure. I sat heavily. Then we were all at risk. Still are. But I believe there is a final safeguard. Holmes reached into his coat and removed a sealed envelope. Yellowed and marked with the same spiral eye sigil we had come to dread. This arrived this morning from Holloway's estate solicitor. He left instructions for it to be delivered, only if he vanished. With care, Holmes opened the envelope and withdrew a single sheet. Upon it were just 3 lines. The sentence was never meant to be spoken. It was meant to be remembered. Break the spiral with your own voice. Holmes read the final line twice, then leaned back in his chair. We assumed the danger was in repetition, he said. But Holloway realized too late that the real key is interruption. The spiral survives only if it remains uninterrupted in its cycle. One cannot merely counter it with silence or inversion. It must be broken by creation, a phrase of one's own, introduced at the point of absorption. You mean improvise? Yes, Holmes said. To speak with intent. Not to echo the shadow, but to inject light into it. The final clue Holloway left is not a warning. It is a cure. He stood and crossed to the fireplace, where the burnt fragment of Aldwich's original parchment lay beneath a glass cloche. He lifted it and stared at the last surviving symbol. I believe, he said softly, that the entire structure of the sentence depended on precision, phonetic purity, rhythm. But introduce chaos, a word unaccounted for, a human voice refusing conformity, and the spell collapses. You saw it with Aldwych. Yes, he said. When I spoke my own phrase, imperfect though it was, the mirror cracked. Not because I reversed him, but because I interrupted the pattern. Holmes turned sharply. Watson, we must return to the spiral chamber. One last time. The chapel was dim when we arrived. The spiral room had been cordoned off with heavy boards and posted guards, but Holmes produced a signed letter from the Home Office, giving us unrestricted access. Thackeray, now wary but cooperative, accompanied us once more. Inside, nothing had moved. The spiral still glowed faintly along the stone, as though the room itself remembered its purpose. Holmes stepped forward and stood in the exact center of the design. He looked down at the cracked pedestal, then to me. You recall the phrase Holloway almost spoke that night? Yes. Holmes drew a breath. I will finish it. Not as he intended it, but in my own words, my voice, not his, not Aldwich's. He closed his eyes and began. What he said was not Latin, nor Greek, nor any known tongue. It was a soft, strange arrangement of syllables that seemed to rise from within him, intuitive and free, like a child describing a dream. The air thickened, the spiral darkened, and then he said my name. Not part of a sentence, not woven into, the incantation, just my name, Watson. The spiral flickered. A pulse ran outward from Holmes's feet, like a ripple across a lake. The spiral vanished. The room fell silent. Then light returned. Outside, the storm clouds that had loomed for days broke at last. A shaft of sunlight pierced through the chapel's upper windows, catching the dust in mid-air like suspended gold. Holmes turned to me, his face calm. "It's over. What did you say?" He gave a rare, faint smile. "I said something imperfect, something alive, something that cannot be replicated by symbols." He stepped past me toward the stair. "This, dear, spiral is not a shape, Watson. It's a trap, and we have broken it." Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The great hall of Tavisham stood silent beneath its arched ceiling, its once comforting architecture now bearing the memory of spirals, shadows, and vanishing men. The long dining table had been cleared, the candelabra polished and unlit, and the curtains drawn back to allow the cold winter sun to stream through. Though the house had been purged of its most immediate horrors, an air of unfinished business hung thick above the floorboards. Sherlock Holmes stood at the head of the table, his hands folded behind his back, his sharp eyes watching each chair as it was filled once more. One by one they came. Lord Tavisham, stern and weary, Miss Judith Claiborne, gaunt, her eyes still distant. Reverend Palmer, who clutched his prayer book as if it alone tethered him to reality. Inspector Thackeray, looking more like a soldier than an officer. And finally, Professor Aldwych, now bound at the wrists, guarded by two plainclothes men, and seated under watch. Only Holloway and Finch were missing. Holmes waited until all were seated before he spoke. "You are all here," he began, "because you bore witness, not merely to an impossible crime, but to its evolution." He walked slowly around the table as he spoke, his voice calm, his steps precise. Mr. Felix Holloway believed he had uncovered something ancient, something that challenged the very foundations of language and reality. He was not wrong, but he was misled. He believed he was at the center of it, when, in truth, he was merely near the center. He paused behind Aldwych. "Professor Aldwych, you saw further. You believed the sentence, the lingua umbrae, could be refined, weaponized, and controlled." Aldwych remained silent. "You were wrong," Holmes continued. "The sentence was not yours to own. It was not meant to be spoken. It was meant to be repeated, to enter the world through replication. You were not its master. You were its vessel." Aldwich's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what I saw in that mirror." "I saw it too," Holmes said, "and I recognized it for what it was. Reflection without identity. The sentence creates not understanding, but replacement. You would have hollowed the world out, word by word, until only pattern remained." Murmur ran through the room. Claiborne flinched. Palmer crossed himself. "But," Holmes said, raising a hand, "it did not succeed." He turned now to the others. "Because of you." His gaze moved to Claiborne. "Miss Claiborne, your hesitation, your refusal to speak the phrase fully when Holloway showed you the fragment. That delayed him." Then to Thackeray. "Your suspicion kept Aldwych under watch long enough for us to act." And to Reverend Palmer. "Your warnings, though veiled, in Scripture pointed to the truth. That language can bind as well as liberate. He returned to the head of the table, and because of that, because we interrupted the pattern, it has been broken. The spiral is fractured. The mirror is gone. Holloway and Finch may not return, but they are no longer transmitting. There was a long silence. Then Lord Tavisham stood. What becomes of Aldwych? Holmes glanced to the inspector. He will be held in the deepest facility the Crown can provide, not as a criminal, but as a carrier. We cannot allow even the echo of his knowledge to spread. Aldwych finally spoke, his voice a dry rasp. You think you've won, but language is memory, and memory returns. Holmes turned slowly. Yes, he said, but so does forgetting. Aldwich's face twisted with disdain, but he said no more. Holmes stepped forward and placed a single page on the table. Tidwin was Holloway's final note, the one sent through his solicitor. Break the spiral with your own voice. He looked at each of us, and for once there was no enigma in his expression, only solemn clarity. I ask you all now to speak. A word, a thought, anything real, a gesture of refusal. So the pattern ends, not with silence, but with noise, human noise. Miss Claiborne was the first. Home, she whispered. Then Reverend Palmer. Hope, Thackeray followed. Rain, Tavisham, memory. I added my own firelight. And Holmes said at last, choice. The silence that followed was no longer oppressive. It was restored. That evening, as the sun set over the hedgerows of Oxfordshire, and the last constables departed, I found Holmes once more at the drawing-room window, watching the wind chase leaves along the gravel path. You did it, I said quietly. You broke the sentence. Holmes's reflection met mine in the glass. No, Watson, we did. Language is never wielded alone. It is shaped between minds, shared, not imposed. He turned to me fully. I have faced murderers, tyrants, even madmen. But this was something older, more seductive, the temptation to erase uncertainty, to replace thought with pattern. And now, Holmes gave a faint, thoughtful smile. Now we choose to speak for ourselves. He lifted his cup of tea, long gone cold. Would you be so kind, my friend, as to remind me of that excellent phrase you once used to describe this sort of storm? I smiled. A black dog on a roofless house. Holmes nodded. Precisely. And in that moment, the storm was truly over. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes Breaks Down. The crime 2 days later, in the quiet warmth of Baker Street, with the fire crackling and the fog once more pressing faintly against the windows. Sherlock Holmes gave his account of the case, not in dramatic flourish, but with that cool, clinical elegance which had made him the most formidable mind in all of England. Watson's notes lay open on the side table. My pen hovered over the page. Holmes lit a fresh pipe and began. This case, Watson, began with a disappearance, but it was never truly about absence. It was always about presence, of an idea, a sentence, a structure of thought so precise that it could displace all others. He stood and crossed to the window where rain slicked the pane in silver streaks. Felix Holloway, he continued, was not a madman, nor merely a linguist obsessed. He was a discoverer. He uncovered fragments of what he called lingua umbrae, the tongue of the shadow, a theoretical phrase which he believed was hidden in the earliest foundations of language. He believed, and perhaps rightly so, that certain phonetic patterns could reprogram perception, not through magic or mysticism, but through cognitive architecture. Language as software, not just symbol. And he tested it. I said, yes. First alone, then with Finch, who was both accomplice and victim. Finch, being a composer, helped him develop the musical equivalent of the phrase, a vibrational blueprint. But when they attempted it at the Tavisham dinner, something unexpected occurred. His disappearance. More precisely, his interruption. Holmes turned to me. He began the phrase, but was silenced. Not by physical force, but by the sentence itself. It was not yet complete, but already powerful enough to fracture his sense of self. He vanished, yes, but not bodily. He was displaced, subtracted from meaning. And the glass, I asked. The missing wine glass. Holmes smiled faintly. That was Finch's reflex, a practical mind grappling with the impossible. He sought to contain the event, to protect Holloway's dignity. But in doing so, he confirmed what I suspected. Something artificial had occurred, something timed, staged. And Aldwych, Holmes's face darkened. Aldwych watched it all with growing envy. He believed Holloway had nearly succeeded. But where Holloway hesitated, Aldwych pushed forward. He retrieved the fragments Holloway left behind, deciphered them further, and attempted to build a complete version of the sentence, one that could be used to overwrite others, to force perception into a new mold. A form of linguistic possession, exactly. Holloway sought understanding. Aldwych sought control. I frowned, and the mirror chamber, the spiral. Holmes returned to his seat. Ancient, older than the house, perhaps even older than the language carved within it. It was not designed to transmit words, but to amplify structure, resonance, repetition. It responded not to belief, but to pattern. Holloway stumbled into it. Aldwych tried to weaponize it. And the final phrase you spoke, I said, setting down my pen. How did you know it would work? Holmes exhaled, long and steady. I didn't. I looked up. But Holloway left a clue in his final note. Break the spiral with your own voice. The sentence gains its power from recursion, from mimicry, from precision. My goal was to violate that rhythm, to assert a new phrase, one rooted in chaos, in tension, and emotion. It wasn't reversal, it was interruption. Humanity inserted into inhuman grammar. He reached into the desk drawer and removed a final slip of paper, one I hadn't seen before. I've rewritten it, he said. My phrase, the one I spoke in the spiral. Do you wish to hear it? I hesitated, then nodded. He handed me the paper. On it were 5 words. I am not your echo. I read it twice. That's all? That's everything, Holmes said softly. He stood and stretched. There are others out there, Watson. Other fragments, other spirals. We may not be finished with this strange tongue, but the key remains constant. When faced with recursive meaning, the answer is not silence, it is resistance. The rain fell more steadily outside now, and Holmes turned once more to the window, pipe in hand. You see, my friend, he murmured, language is not only the mirror of the mind, it is its frontier, and we must be careful who and what crosses it. I looked down at the slip of paper again. 5 words, unremarkable to the casual reader. But I understood now, they were not just words. They were a wall, a flare in the fog, a choice, A refusal to vanish. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. News of the events at Tavisham Hall reached the papers in only the most diluted of forms. Distinguished professor declared unfit after sudden collapse at country retreat. Read one headline. Strange malady strikes Oxford Circle, said another. There was no mention of disappearing men, linguistic constructs, or spirals etched into stone. The public received the event as a whisper. A minor scandal of academia swept beneath the velvet rug of aristocratic discretion. Sherlock Holmes made certain of that. "Better the world forgets," he said as we returned once again to Baker Street, our luggage lighter than when we had left. "There are doors which must remain shut, not because they lead to darkness, but because the corridor beyond them is unfinished." Professor Aldwych was transferred under orders from the Home Office to a secured sanatorium in Sussex. Not a prison, though the guards were as well trained as any at Pentonville. There, he was neither prosecuted nor questioned in court, but held indefinitely. His writings, notes, and all related manuscripts classified and removed from academic circulation. A special Act of Parliament passed quietly ensured that none of his publications on theoretical linguistics would ever see republication. I visited him once, at Holmes's suggestion. He sat in a clean white room with no windows and only one chair. His hands were steady, his hair combed. He looked up at me with the eerie calm of someone whose war is over, even if they had lost. "They stopped me," he said, his voice as thin as air. "But the structure remains. You wanted control," I told him, "but you gave up understanding." Aldwych smiled. "Understanding is for those who are still uncertain. I know now what I am." "And what is that?" His eyes gleamed. "A carrier. The guards removed me after that. I never returned." Back in London, Holmes resumed his routines as if no spirals had ever darkened his doorstep. He took 2 minor cases in the week that followed. One involving a missing tobacconist's son in Whitechapel. Another concerning an heiress and a forged will. But his manner had changed. Not dramatically, not outwardly. But I, who knew the man better than anyone alive, could see it. He spoke a little less. His silences grew longer. And when he picked up the violin at night, his playing took on a new texture. Not melancholy, as was often his mood, but deliberate, as though each note were being chosen carefully, weighed for its resonance before released. On one such evening, I asked him directly, "Do you believe it's truly over?" He paused only briefly in his playing. "The spiral is broken, but the patterns resurge, Watson, in language, in thought, in history." He set down the violin. "But now we know how to listen. That is enough." The estate of Felix Holloway passed to his brother in Devon, who, having no interest in linguistics, donated the professor's remaining books to a private library in York. The Fragmentum Noctis, the manuscript that had first set Holloway on his path, was officially listed as lost in fire. Only Holmes and I knew it had been sealed in a lead-lined chest and buried beneath St. Pancras Crypt by order of the Crown. Judith Claiborne disappeared from society altogether. Rumor had her in Florence, painting landscapes. Another claimed she had joined a monastery. Holmes received one letter from her, unsigned, postmarked from an obscure village in the Pyrenees. It read, "There is a kind of diligence that heals." I've found it, I think. No words remain, only echoes fading at last into peace. He burned the letter after reading it. And what of the others? Percival Finch was never found. Some said he drowned himself in the lake behind Tavisham. Though nobody was ever recovered, others claimed he had walked into the woods during the night of Aldwich's collapse, mumbling a lullaby to no one. Holmes, for his part, believed Finch had not died at all, but had simply stepped sideways into that peculiar fold in cognition where thought breaks loose from time. He lives, Holmes once said, but not in any way we would recognize. And Holloway? Of him, Holmes said nothing. Not until one morning, nearly a month after our return, when he received a plain envelope with no stamp. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no words, only a hand-drawn spiral, and beneath it a phrase. I remembered something that was never said. Holmes read it once and placed it in the drawer. When I asked him what it meant, he gave only a small smile. Perhaps, he said, it means that some spirals do not trap. Some simply spin and end. On our final walk that winter, Holmes paused beneath the bare branches of Regent's Park, the world crisp with frost and distant church bells, ringing like punctuation. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do you know why the sentence failed? Because you interrupted it. Yes, but not with reason, not with deduction. It was something more primitive," I frowned. "Emotion?" "No," he said. "Choice, free, unpatterned, irrational choice. That is what cannot be replicated. That is what saved us." He looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted, and for the first time in weeks, the sun shone cleanly on the earth. "Remember that, my friend," Holmes said. "When language becomes a trap, it is will that breaks it." And we walked on, leaving the last echo of the spiral behind us. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. It was on a quiet March afternoon that I found myself once again in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, watching the thin coils of smoke rise from Sherlock Holmes's pipe as he sat motionless in his armchair. The case of Felix Holloway, the spiral sentence, and the vanishing mid-speech had long since passed from public interest, replaced by the usual news of society scandals and war murmurs abroad. But for Holmes, and for me, it lingered. Perhaps it always would. He had returned to his usual habits, more or less. The violin had resumed its nightly monologues. Newspapers were clipped with enthusiasm. Experiments resumed with vigor. And yet, there was a stillness to him now, a greater patience, a quietness not born of exhaustion, but of comprehension. That afternoon, as rain tapped gently at the window pane, I broke the silence. "Holmes," I said, "have you ever feared the limits of deduction? That reason alone might not always be enough." He did not answer at once. Instead, he stared into the fireplace, where the embers glowed like ancient eyes. Then, at length, he spoke. "No," he said, "not fear, Watson, but recognition." He turned toward me. "There are things in this world not meant to be solved, only understood. And there are things not meant to be understood, only recognized as thresholds." He picked up a slip of paper from the mantel, a folded page I hadn't noticed before. He opened it and handed it to me. It was one of Holloway's phrases, written in that careful, slanted hand. "The mouth is the last gate. What passes through it shapes the world." Holmes watched my face as I read. Holloway believed that meaning could be transmitted like infection. He said, "A dangerous idea," but he was wrong in one crucial aspect. What was that? He thought the sentence controlled the listener. Holmes leaned forward. But it is the listener who gives it power. Without reception, without context, a phrase is merely sound. It is the mind that gives it form. He tapped his temple once, gently. All control begins with consent. I nodded slowly, and Aldwych Holmes sighed, still silent. His mind is intact, but stilled. He has not spoken since that night. Will he ever? Holmes stood and crossed to the window, gazing out at the wet street, where hansoms rolled through the puddles like ghosts. I do not know, he said, but I suspect that somewhere in the echo chamber of his thoughts, the spiral still spins, diminished, dying, waiting. He turned back toward me, and the flicker of that old brilliance returned to his eyes. But it no longer matters. I raised an eyebrow. No? Because we spoke over it, he said. We interrupted. And in that interruption, chaotic, flawed, human, we reclaimed our right to name the world ourselves. He walked to the desk, selected a fresh page, and scribbled something across the top. Then he held it out for me to see. It read, "The man who disappeared mid-sentence." I smiled. "Fitting," I said. Holmes nodded. "It was never really about how he disappeared, Watson. It was about why. About what happens when meaning turns inward. When a sentence forgets, it has an audience." He set the page down gently and returned to his chair, stretching long legs before the fire. I sat beside him, and together we watched the evening close in, the world outside darkening into the familiar comforts of twilight. No spirals, no symbols, only breath and the rustle of coal. And silence, this time unburdened.